So let's get started. Second half. All right, so now we're going to delve into the actual RenderMan portion of Maya, which is reliant on you having downloaded RenderMan, having installed it properly, and having enabled it in the plugins manager. Because if you don't enable RenderMan, you're not going to get render using RenderMan as an option. You're also not going to get the RenderMan shelf. We use the RenderMan shelf quite a bit. And so the RenderMan interface is pretty much broken down into a couple of tabs inside the render setting. So in case you haven't been made aware of or never actually understood all the different parts of the render setting, the common tab, which is the very first one, is common to everything that comes into Maya. Whether it's Arnold, whether it's V-Ray, whether it's I-Ray, whether it's Mental Ray, whether it's RenderMan. All right, common means those are common characteristics to every render. That being name, whether it's a single frame or multiple frames, the size of it, the camera you're rendering from. The size is really important. All right, now, the sampling portion, which is the second tab over, contains most of the settings that we're going to be using in RenderMan. For example, the top part under sampling, those mid-sample, max samples, pixel variance, dark fall off, those are your main production quality settings. By production quality, I mean that is the final version that you will render when you turn in your scene. Yep, your assignment. IPR, since it is interactive, does not have as many controls. It's meant to be a simpler interface. There are only two settings: max samples and pixel variance. Yep. Integrator, that tells RenderMan which integrator or which kind of renderer to do. It's broken down into 6 different, what they call integrators or modules within RenderMan. The default one that we're going to be using is called Path Tracer. Default ray depths, that allows the rays that are shot out into the scene to either go through objects, bounce off objects, or stop. And then filtering. Filtering at the bottom is set up to be default of a Gaussian filter, which is a very gentle blurring filter. If anybody's familiar with Photoshop, the Gaussian blur we usually use to smooth out things. And the filter size. It's basically a pixel radius. How far does the blur extend? And the default of 2 by 2 is usually 2 pixels by 2 pixels. And all that does is gently kind of soften the image so it looks a little more realistic. One of the common problems with early CG was it looked too perfect. You could see pixel, 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 pixel. You could see every detail. Well, we want our pixels to look more like images that we're used to seeing. In particular, photographs. We're used to seeing that in any other display that we have. So we soften the pixels a little bit, meaning we blur them, we average them together with pixels that are right next to them. It tends to make our images look a little more believable. And it also helps to smooth any imperfections out on a real simple basis. Now, this part is really important. Please write this down inside your eyelids if you have to, on your hand, anywhere you're going to look, right on the mirror when you get up in the morning. For RenderMan, use the power of 2 when plugging numbers in for min samples or max samples. Power of 2 means 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 512, 256 is in there between 128, 512. 1024, 1024, if you have to go beyond 1024, we have another problem. So 1024, I would say, is the absolute max that you need to go to at any point. And even for our class, that's a bit high, because we're going to be using something called the denoise filter, which allows us to use less high samples. But we're talking just about min samples. So here's the way min samples work. Min samples by default are set to 0. 0 means that they do not have no minimum samples. 0 for Pixar, remember this is Pixar. Pixar means this is the square root of that number. Right? Square root. Frightens us. It confounds us. Don't be that frightened. You all have calculators on your Mac. They all have a very simple function called scientific. So when you get frightened, you open your calculator, you go to View, and you choose Scientific. Why? Because here you have square roots and the power of 2 squares that you can calculate automatically. So Pixar, by default, gives us, in a scene, when you first fire up RenderMan, gives you 0 min samples, 128 max samples. What is the square root of 128? Who knows? Look it up. So I type in 128, hit the square root, and it comes up with 11.31370849849. I don't know. Too many nines. Here's the thing to remember about min samples. If your min samples are 0, it's going to be the square root of that number. The square root of this number is 128. 128 gives us 11.31. That is not a power of 2 number. Can you guys see that? Right? So what we do is, to make it more efficient, and we've learned this through trial and error, and sleepless nights, and headaches, fatigue, query burned into the forehead when you bang your head on the keyboard, that if you stick to the power of 2, it is a lot more efficient, and RenderMan likes that better. You got to feed the beast. So if you have 128 as your max samples, if you leave it at 0, it'll be 11.31. Not a horrible thing, but it's not going to be efficient. And everything about rendering is efficiency. Because time equals money, and anytime you can shave a couple of seconds off a render, that multiplies over an animation. How many frames a second? 16. Or, in video, 30. Okay? Multiply that by 10 minutes. Multiply that by an hour, by 90 minutes, by 2 hours. You shave a couple of seconds off per frame, you can shave hours off of the render time at the end. And that's where it really becomes a big deal, to be as efficient and brutal as possible with your time when you render. So, what we tend to do is, if we are going to use 128 for our max samples, if we leave this at 0, it's not going to be as efficient. Then if we bump it up to the first power of 2 number that's close to 11, it's going to be, no, that's not power of 2. 16. Yep. So just remember, 2, 4, 8, just double it. 8, 8, 16, 16, 16, 32, 32, 32, 64. Right? Always go up to the next power of 2 number. You don't want to go lower to 8 because you might have an area that requires more samples, minimum samples, than 8. That means it's getting sampled 8 times. Does that make sense? Now, the next power of 2, suppose you decide, I've rendered this out, 128 is not enough, my scene still looks weird. We call it noise. It looks gritty, it looks grainy, it looks like it has dirt in it. So, if I need more, I bump it up to the next power of 2 for the max samples. Next power of 2 from 128 would be what? 256. Now, if I leave all right, 256, the square root of 256 is 16. So technically, I could take my min samples and put it back to 0. Or I could just leave 16. Does that make sense? So next, after 256 is 512. So 512 square root 22.62. So if I leave my min samples at 0, that's not very efficient. So what would I bump my min samples to if I were using 512?
32.
32, exactly. That's how you play this game. Now, to be honest, most of the time, 512 is suitable enough for a render. When I say suitable enough, you're going to find out when we get talking into the denoise filter, there's going to be a certain level of noise that you're not going to be able to get rid of unless you dump an ungodly number of samples in to the max number, like 2048 or 4096, which you don't have to because the denoise filter can remove a lot of the noise that's left over. So 512, I would say, is not a hard cap, but that should be where you should think about checking your scene out to make sure the rest of your settings are as efficient as possible. Yeah.
So if I put 512, I can leave minimum at 0, or should I match it
Well,
with
512, if you leave it at 0, it's going to revert to the minimum samples to be 22.62.
So it'll do it automatically even if it's 0?
Now, unless you plug a number in there, if you choose to use 16 as your min samples, then it's going to use 16. Whatever number you plug in here, if it's not 0, it's not going to use the square root. Which is why I say if you use 0 and you're doing 512, you should be bumping it up to 32 for your min samples. Because 32 is going to be more efficient power of 2 than 22.62 or whatever it is. So you can make yourself a little chart and go, all right, 256, 1024, those are all friendly power of 2 numbers. Why 1024? Well, if I do 1024 and do the square root's 32. So 256, 1024, those are square root friendly numbers. 128, 512, you're going to have to plug in the min samples to be as efficient as possible manually to a square root or to a power of 2 numbers. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about that part? Now, if you plug in 386, it'll still render for your max samples, but that is not very efficient. Remember, everything's built on pixels. Pixels are square. They're built in blocks. That if it can define a block, it's going to be almost impossible to find 22.62 pixels. That doesn't make sense. It's a lot more efficient if it can have whole numbers, power of 2 friendly numbers when it goes to calculate. So min samples, power of 2. So here's my little chart right here. Take a screenshot if you need to. Whatever you want to do, write it down yourself, figure it out yourself. It's not really that hard. Stick to the power of 2. Now, for the max samples, exactly the same thing. The max samples are the maximum number that it's going to dump into your scene. Stick to the power of 2, again, more efficient. Because we're dealing with bulk numbers. Now, take a look at some of the samples that are up here. Okay? So at 128 samples, it's shooting out 66 million rays into the scene. Those are just direct light camera rays. Okay, so for indirect, it's shooting out 331 million. You combine camera and indirect, it's shooting almost 400 million rays into the scene to find out what's going on. If you're shooting that many rays out there, power of 2 efficiency is really important because you want to, with that many rays going out, you want them to be organized as efficiently as possible to where they're going. All right, so min samples, max samples. Pixel variance. This is where you can turn your renderer from adaptive rendering into what we call fixed rendering. So, when the pixel variance is greater than 0, you are doing adaptive sampling. All right? These numbers are always going to be decimal numbers here. All right, as you increase this number, you're basically raising the threshold. Which means the difference between a pixel in one pass and a pixel in another pass has to be greater for it to stop rendering. When you lower this number to 0, you're basically saying every single pixel gets treated the same way. Same thing if you left this number alone and you made this 128. The minimum is 128, the maximum is 128, that's fixed sampling. You're telling it every pixel gets 128 samples. If you leave this at 0, you put this at 128, put this to 0, you're doing the same thing. Pixel variance is how different is one pixel when it samples from the same pixel in the following pass. If it changes, then it's going to be resampled. If it doesn't change, then it's going to more or less be called done. So think of it kind of as a fine-tuning threshold. Now, a lot of the noise that we see is in what we call indirect light areas. Now, if you take a look around in our room, you can see we've got some light from the ceiling hitting the wall. The light on the wall is a result of direct light, right here. Areas that are in between the lights, the shadowy area where it doesn't get direct light, that would be indirect light. It's always easier to clean up or denoise or render a nice image with direct light than it is with indirect light. Because indirect light relies on light that bounces around. We all deal with indirect light all the time. We're going to get into lighting a lot more in next lecture. But if we shut all the computers down, turn the lights off, we would still have light in this room. From where? Outside. So we would get light coming in. Is that direct light from outside? No. No. So it's either from the ceiling or it's coming from the door or the windows, but it's indirect light bouncing around with enough energy that it's going to find its way in here, bounce around until it runs out of energy or goes somewhere else. So indirect light, since it is not a result of a ray directly hitting a surface from light, that takes more time to calculate. Where that ray from the light ray from the projector hitting my hand, that is direct light, this would be cleaned up really quickly. Because the ray can find the path almost unobstructed. Whereas if I'm off to the side, then the projector has to hit the screen's got to hit the floor, it's got to hit you, it's got to hit the ceiling, then it's going to get me eventually. So it just takes more processing time to calculate indirect light. So as a result, we tend to get more noise in shadowy areas. So what happens is we have another threshold for what we call dark fall-off, really dark shadowy areas. So if you're having a lot of problem where everything looks really good except you've got a really kind of dark area that's really noisy, you just can't get rid of it, you might need to lower this number a little bit. that will send more sampling into those shadowy areas. Now, by lowering it a little bit, I don't mean like taking it down to 0.02499. You probably want to go in 500 point increments. Like knock it down to maybe 0.02, 0.015, something like that. But it's going to increase your render time, so it's all a trade-off. To be honest, most of the time we try to leave these at the default because they are optimized to give us the best overall result right out of the box. So I go over these because they're kind of like a fine-tuning instrument that you use once you understand how sampling and rendering works. These two are your base go-to numbers for final. Question?
So if I crank up the dark fog more, so that will add extra noise to my dark areas?
It would speed up your render time, not necessarily add more noise, but not
Clean it up?
clean it up, not spend enough time in there.
Okay. So,
You're basically telling it areas that are kind of shadowy, we've got a higher threshold of what we call done than before. All right, IPR, quick preview. Generally, max samples, the default are 64. To be honest, I usually turn it down to 32 because I want quick feedback for this. Once I've gotten what I want out of IPR, then I start doing production quality renders to see what it looks like cleaned up. But this is just for placement and position. You will never, given just these two settings, you'll never be able to get a production quality render out with just IPR. It's not designed for that. It's just designed to give you a preview. You like what you see, you start using bigger numbers up here to get a final render. The pixel variance works the same way as it does in the sampling section. So IPR, you can leave it at the default. It'll take a little bit longer to render. But today, the workflow, since you guys are just going to be learning how to render, the workflow is going to be, we're going to do one pass in IPR. That means we're going to let it go just to see what the base scene looks like. It's going to be noisy, but based on that information, we can make decisions on using production quality renders. Because there's going to be some steps that we can do that will help us fine-tune. We're just using that to get a rough idea. Are my lights on? Do I have the right camera? Is everything working properly before I start rendering longer? All right, integrator. There are different types of integrators. So the debug shading context, that's just a quick renderer to see if there's any manifold geometry, any kind of weird shading bugs going on. Default gives you a render just like the viewport when you hit the 5 key or 6 key, depending on if you're using texture. Direct lighting, that turns off global illumination. You only get direct light. You're going to get a lot of contrast in your scene. Occlusion. Do you guys do occlusion in mono creation? Ambient occlusion?
yeah.
Use Arnold?
Yeah.
Have to apply a separate material shader to it and do all that? You don't have to in RenderMan. You just turn on occlusion and it renders it for you. That's all it does. It just makes everything black and white, and occlusion is just based off of whether a ray hits an object or it doesn't. If it doesn't hit an object, it comes back as white. If it hits an object immediately, it comes back as black. If it takes a while to hit an object, it comes back as some form of gray. It's just blocking a ray from its destination. RenderMan is smart enough. Path tracer, that's what we use by default. VCN is what's called bidirectional path tracer. It does it in 2 directions. A little more expensive, unnecessary for what we're doing. Validate VXVF. Again, VXVF is the material portion of the settings that we have. And then visualizer. This kind of gives you almost a wireframe look. All right, now, in Path Tracer, you've got a number called max path length. The default is 10. Quite frankly, we leave it at 10 for most of the time. We're not even going to notice whether that number is good or not until we get into materials. Because this allows a ray to be traced 10 times from where it's shot at. And we're only doing diffuse materials, which are like Lambert. There's virtually just very little bounce going around. This max continuation, we don't even worry about that. Sample mode, BXDF, that is the material mode. It's bidirectional, which means it measures it from 2 different directions. Number of light samples, this is direct light. Number of material samples, and number of indirect samples. These kind of work like fine-tuning areas for the maximum number of samples. These are multipliers, which means that if you leave these at 1, they will use 1/28 for all of these. Whether it's direct light, whether it's a material, or whether it's indirect light. Now, direct light and material, Pixar recommends if you change this number, you need to change this number to match it. Direct light and BXDF numbers should always be the same. Just be aware, if you increase this, say you go to 10, you're going to be multiplying the max samples in direct light areas to be 10 times above 128. Now, indirect, most of the time, if we increase anything here, it's probably going to be this number. And to be honest, most of the time when I do it, I'll usually try to leave these at the default of 1 to save render time, and I might bump that up to 2. So, direct light, like hitting the surface directly. BXDF, the material that's on the surface, those two need to be the same. Indirect, areas over here that don't get hit with direct light. That's a separate control for this. And again, multipliers based off of what the max samples are, and min samples. All right, questions? That makes sense?
Could I bump up the light samples in BFX and leave the direct at 1?
Yes, you could.
What if the
Why you would want to do that, I don't know, only because you'll find that most of your noise is going to come from indirect. The direct light, since it's hitting the surface, this is going to clean up the coils. You'll find that out in the renders that I give you guys today to do. But yes, you can do that. Now, to be honest, Pixar has told us, because we have a good friend who works over at Pixar, his name is David Hackett, he used to teach here. And he comes in, he's on our advisory board, he comes in and talks to us about RenderMan, tells us what's going on. He said a lot of these controls are going to go away in 22. They're going to be automated. So what they're looking for is, you want good quality, turn it up. That's it. They're looking to make it as simple as possible for the user. However, you're still going to be able to go under the hood to fine tune it when you know what you're doing, or you need to know what you're doing. All right, good question, though. Any others? All right, so to describe path tracing, believe it or not, I found this on Disney's website. Disney is owned by who? Disney, right. They own the world. Who owns Pixar?
Disney.
Do anybody know what Pixar uses to render? RenderMan. How about Disney?
No, they have an engine they generate or something.
They started with Wreck-It Ralph. I think it was with
Frozen.
the dog.
Bolt?
Bolt. They started with
Was it
Bolt.
Bolt or the, that's a Disney movie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bolt is Disney.
Bolt, yeah.
But that was one of their first forays into rendering engines, but they didn't do it alone. Their engine called Hyperion,
Yes.
named after where the original Hyperion Drive, which is where
Disney
Disney
Hyperion.
Animation Studios was in
Wait, that's also a publishing thing.
yeah, it's their publishing company. Anyway, Hyperion is a Pixar RenderMan-like engine because the guy who designed RenderMan, Ed Catmull, also helped design Hyperion. But the difference between them is Disney has a look that they want. And you can see it's definitely different when you look at their stuff versus Pixar. It's just got a different look to it, just how they wanted the rendering engine to operate. But they all use the same functionality, and it's all path tracing. So believe it or not, on their website I found a very Disney 1940-ish looking description of path tracing. So it's actually really good. There's a link inside lesson 1 if you actually want to. They have some other good videos in there too if anybody's interested. Turn that down. Okay. All right, so path tracing. So, again, camera rays to light source. That's basically what we do. And the quickest path gets us the quickest results. That's why direct light is usually the easiest to calculate, because it is a shorter distance from the source to the camera. All right, any questions about path tracing? They did a pretty good job describing it in that old 1940s Disney style, even though it was just done last year. All right, so we have 3 main ways to render in RenderMan. We have what's called render current frame. That uses production quality settings. We have the IPR renderer. It uses the image tool, the IP, and IPR setting. And then we have batch rendering. Batch rendering is how we're going to do final renders at completion. Batch rendering also allows us to use the denoise filter. The denoise filter is not available in either render current frame or IPR. It's basically a post-process because it looks at your scene, goes through, analyzes it with all the information in there, and then applies the filter. All right, now, render current frame is the very first button on the left side. You can produce production quality final renders with this, but no denoise filter. Uses all the production settings from the top of the sampling tab. Image format is chosen after you're done rendering, and you go to save it out of the image tool. We always choose OpenEXR half and save it to your selected area. IPR, you can save it out, but it's always going to be a preview quality render. Uses the image tool. You can right-click. One advantage is you can right-click on the IPR button and select the camera you want to render from. The problem with render current frame, the very first button there, is you need to be in the render cam in the viewport for it to render properly. Does not have the ability for you to choose a camera. I don't know why they chose it that way. Image format, like I said, you can choose that when you go to save it out, but it's never going to be production quality. Batch rendering. Batch rendering is available only in the RenderMan menu set. It also means that you need to have your render settings set up ahead of time for batch rendering to work. Because it's going to use the file name that's in your render settings, the image format that's in your render settings, and then any filters like denoise will be utilized when you go to render with batch rendering. Nice thing about batch rendering is once it kicks off and it actually starts, you can actually close Maya down. It's an independent program that runs. However, most of the time you want to wait to make sure you don't have to render it again before you quit out of Maya. But if you're doing a batch render of an animated sequence and you've got a lot of frames to render, if you quit out of Maya, it's a little more efficient. It doesn't use as much memory with Maya open.
Still rendering for.
Yes, because what it does is it takes your scene file, writes a temporary file from it that it reads all the render information it needs. It doesn't rely on Maya's interface at all. And that's kind of the beauty of batch rendering. When you're doing the image tool, it pops up a little window in Maya that renders in that window for you. Okay, that is graphical user interface window. It takes resources from actual rendering because it's got to display what it's doing for you. That's all fine and well when you're in the interactive state. But for a final render, you don't need any graphical interface at all. So it can actually render faster without the graphical interface, the same frame than if you rendered it from the production button, the render current frame. Because it doesn't have to draw any image for you while it's working on it. So a lot more efficient. That's why we always use batch render for the final version. Does that make sense? A lot more efficient. All right, so batch render pops up this whole local queue, and it gives you this window right here. It'll tell you the job as it's running, and if you're doing a single frame, you'll get 4 parts to the job. Don't worry about what they are. Just know that the first one is kind of like the header. It's saying, hey, this is the job you're going to render. The second one, this will show you a percentage of your rendering. The second part, this applies the denoise filter, and then this just wraps up the job. When it's done, it'll say done. You'll be all set. It will automatically write those frames into your RenderMan folder in your project. Now, every time you work on something for our class, you're going to be working in a project-based folder structure. You guys understand what that is from previous classes? When you create a Maya project folder, it's got a whole bunch of subfolders in it. It uses all of that to keep track of information. Put your scenes in the scenes folder, it grabs all the information and files that it needs from source images. It'll dump renders. In the case of RenderMan, RenderMan creates its own folder in there, and it dumps all its stuff in there for you. If you do simulations, there's a cache folder. There's a render data folder where it keeps track. It just drops stuff wherever it needs it. And it knows it's there. You take that project folder, you can give it to another computer. As long as they set their project, they'll get all the data that you have. That means you can give somebody a scene file, have them open it up, not be missing anything if you do it right. Always work in a project folder structure. All right, so batch rendering, we set up all the settings in the render settings. In the common tab, file name, if you choose not to name it, it'll use the scene file name by default. Some of them are short, some of them might be really long. So you can name it to whatever you want. My first render, scene 1, project 1, whatever you want to name it to. Then you choose the image format, OpenEXR. If you don't choose that, you're going to get some weird image format. OpenEXR, so RenderMan, when it's done rendering, knows how to save it out. And then we go into the advanced RenderMan controls if for some reason OpenEXR is not available. And when I open up Maya and show you my version of Maya, I don't have that as an option, so I have to go into the choose whether it's a single frame or a multiple frame animated sequence. For us, single frame. It's going to be the file name dot the extension, meaning .exr. And then choose the camera you want to render from. We give you renderable cameras or render cams. You choose that as your camera to render from. If not, it will try to render from perspective. You don't want to go and do a whole batch render, spend 20 minutes waiting for it to render, and then you realize it's perspective rather than the right camera. All right, so this is an example of a render without the denoise filter. Now you're looking at it blown up, so it is going to look a little bit pixelated. It is going to look alias. But what I want you to take a look at is in these areas here where I've got the box. It's going to be a little hard to tell, but there's, it looks like noise and dirt.
It looks grainy.
Grainy, good word. So that is without the denoise filter. Now this is with the denoise filter. So it's still broken up, but that's because we're increasing the size of a fixed image. But less grainy, less noisy. Let me go back and forth a couple times. If you're using Go to Training, it should be a little bit better. You should be able to see it better. So no filter, no denoise, with denoise.
Yeah, it's pretty out.
Now, the goal is if you can get your scene to this level of noise, that is acceptable. And then when you go to do a final batch render, you put denoise on it, we'll get rid of the rest of the noise for you. But if you're not about 85, 90% free of noise, and you apply the denoise filter, it's just going to blur stuff. It's not going to look right. It's not going to operate properly. So I use this as an example just so you can see what the minimal acceptable level of noise is before you use the denoise filter. Now, when you render out for the first time and use the denoise filter, you're actually going to get two images. You're going to get one that's unfiltered, which is a really huge file size. And then when it's done, it reads through that file, denoises it, and creates a separate file called a filtered file. That's the one you're going to use and plug into your templates for turning. That's going to be your final version. So you're always going to get two renders. It's always the filtered one you want. All right, so here's the image tool. They call it. The image tool is basically where you work as you're trying to figure out how much sampling I need. You know, do I need to, is my camera set up right? Are my lights on? Do I have the right location in the environment? You're doing that to figure out a whole bunch of stuff. Now, this window, by default, should give you three parts. You should have a catalog here. This basically keeps a running list of all the renders you've done. You can basically go in here and click on any item in the catalog and it will display the image that it's associated with. So it just keeps a list of all your images until you close out the image tool. On the right side is the inspector. When you click on an image, the inspector will tell you what was your min sample, what was your max sample, what integrator did you use, and also any direct light, VXDF, and indirect light samples you did. It will give you all that information listed here. So as you change images, that information on the right will change. These two areas in the window, the catalog and the inspector, you can open and close them if you want to. If they're not visible, you can go up into the image tool menu and make them visible, or you can hit the C key for catalog or I key for inspector. That'll turn them off and on. in your image tool. All right, a couple of important features in the image tool. One of the big ones we use all the time is called the crop tool. That allows us to do a broad, say, IPR render, find an area we want to work on, and crop just that area and render a small piece so we can see what higher sample levels look like. That's how we figure out what our sample setting should be. So we've got the crop tool, render again, which is really good. We can toggle a background to have it on. I'll show you this stuff when we actually fire it up. I just want to kind of go through this high-level stuff with you. All right, that's a good place to pause and fire up RenderMan. All right, so a couple things. Make sure you've got the latest version of Maya 2018.3. If it goes by too quick, in the splash screen, you can always go up to the Maya menu to About Maya. That will tell you the version you have. Now, as it's loading, you have to wait, because by default, RenderMan loads in last. The first thing that's going to load in before RenderMan is going to be Arnold. After Arnold, then RenderMan will pop in. So there we go. Arnold, RenderMan, all showed up at the top, right here, right before the Help menu. So with RenderMan loaded, I know I'm good to go. Now, if for some reason you turn on Maya, you don't see the RenderMan menu, you also don't see the shelf for RenderMan, you want to go in and make sure it's loaded. So you go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. Maya's got a ton of plugins. They're basically little modules that you can turn off and on to make Maya more efficient. That allows you to turn off things that you're not using. So let's see. Nope, wrong one. There. All right, so all of what we call third-party plugins are at the bottom. So you scroll down. Notice there's no dividers in here. That's all pure Maya. All right, so down here, underneath the first subsection, this is where all your third-party plugins come in. Bifrost, Mesh. RenderMan's going to be right here. Now, one thing you want to have on is Apply to All, the very top button, Loaded and Auto Load. This will load everything underneath and auto load it every time you run Maya. You need to have this Open VDB bundle and the RenderMan for Maya bundle. If you don't have them, you're going to have trouble batch rendering. Now, you don't need to do anything else. Once you've got that clicked, you can just hit Close. RenderMan should pop up, and you can open your render settings. Render settings are the little, looks like a Hollywood clapper with a gear on it. Says Render Settings if you hover above it. And when you open it up, it should say Render using RenderMan. Because RenderMan's going to be one of those, oh, you want to use RenderMan? I want to be your default renderer. Do you want to be my friend? Turn me on.
Render setups, right?
Render setups?
Yeah. Or render settings.
Settings. It's a button right here.
No, I haven't seen an expert, so I don't have that. Where will you find that on the?
You need to have buttons.
Huh?
You need to have buttons.
Really?
Yeah. Either that or you're going to have to go hunt and peck through all the menus.
It's going to be under Windows, rendering, but you need to have the menus at least because this is where you're going to get your stuff at. All right, so RenderMan Common tab. Here is your file naming right here, file output. Again, if you do not choose to change this, it will use whatever your scene is called. Right now, I don't have anything open. It's an untitled document, so right now it just says untitled. All right, so I can call this Lecture1. If I hit enter, now at the top of my render settings, it says file name Lecture1. It says .iff. Wait, I don't want IFF format. I want OpenEXR. So I click in here and I go, oh crap, I don't have OpenEXR. Anybody have that problem? All right, so what you do is you close the render settings, you go to the RenderMan menu, and you go to the Advanced RenderMan Controls. Click on Advanced RenderMan Controls, and it brings up RenderMan's version of the render settings. However, it will have image format as OpenEXR. You want to change it, make sure it says OpenEXR. To be honest, I use this all the time because mine doesn't display EXR in the regular Maya render settings. So I just use the RenderMan ones. Now, under frame animation extension, you want to have single frame. We are not doing multiple frames. So, name.extension, single frame. Right, frame padding, you don't have to worry about any of that. This is where you choose your camera also. So, for the scenes we give you, you're going to have a render cam in the list here. Right now, again, this is a blank document. I don't have one. I'm going to open up a scene in a second. This is also where you choose image size. And then you go over to sampling once you're done. And you go, oh, okay, I recognize this. Here's the min samples. Here's the max samples. There's my IPR. I'm going to drop mine down to 32 because I'm lazy and I don't like to wait. Integrator, there's the max path length of 10. The integrator by default should be the path tracer. All the other settings, you don't have to worry about. Now, you may be tempted to go down here under Russian roulette because, ooh, that's really tempting. I will explain to you very briefly what Russian roulette is. And not what you think. But it is in rendering terms. It's like pointing a gun at your head. Russian roulette is basically when your scene has samples dumped onto it, they are dumped in a random fashion. Okay, make sense? Random. They're just dumped on it. When you go to do Russian roulette, what it's doing is it is re-randomizing a random function, which is called a Monte Carlo algorithm, which means that when you render something, you dump samples on it. Some areas are going to have samples clumped more than others, just because it's a random function. Think if you took a handful of wet sand and threw it against the wall. It's not going to splatter evenly, right? Some areas are going to be clumped, other areas are going to be really sparse. When you re-randomize it, you are basically spreading out all the clumping as much as possible through a random function. Make sense? You don't have to mess with it. The bottom line. Because you can really shoot yourself in the foot if you don't know what you're doing.
Why would I use it?
Why would you?
Yeah.
If you know what you're doing, you could use it, but for our purposes, the renderer is random enough to dump stuff for us.
In a professional setting, why would I use a random roulette?
To remove clumping areas for noise. When I open up our scene, remind me and I'll point out areas to you that you're gonna notice them right away when you start clumping together. It's gonna be a lot easier when I actually have a scene. But I just want to kind of go over the interface a little bit, not worried about having the scene open. All right. Features. This is where your denoise filter is. So when you go to do a final render, you come under denoise and you change it to frame. The other setting, cross frame, is used for animation. When you've got more than one frame, it reads all the frames and then denoises all the frames at once. So cross frame not needed for a single frame. Make sense? It'll save you time too. All right, the type of filter, the default is fine. In fact, default gives us the best results. Again, this is going to be going away, and you're either going to have a denoise button or you're not in the future. Advanced, we don't actually get into anything in here except for turning on linearized colors. But we'll get into that when we deal with materials. Right. Questions so far? Now, let me kind of go over, before I actually open the scene up, I want to kind of go over what you guys are going to be doing today. So the whole idea behind this is we are giving you two pre-done scenes. One is a daytime scene, one is a nighttime scene with different lighting in both. They're pre-lit. Your job is to pick one of 4 cameras that are in there to render from. One daytime, one nighttime render. Your job is to get it to be as clean as possible to match the reference image that we give you. Alright, so you're going to be worrying about sampling, making sure the path tracer is set correctly. You're going to be using the IPR in the render current frame, and then final render is going to be batch rendering. There's some reading here for you. There's some RenderMan help docs if you need to. Campus Archive lecture. There's a couple of playlists for lesson 1. There's the Disney Guide to Path Tracing if you want to watch it again. Installing RenderMan. If you haven't gotten Substance Painter, you got plenty of time. We don't get into that until lecture 9.
Yeah, Substance Painter was required for NCR.
Good. So you guys have it already.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you know basic interface.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sweet. All right. That'll cut down a lot of time.
Fun.
Good. So we'll actually be able to get more into it. And actually, for that lecture, our associate course director, Tony Bagsby, is going to be coming in doing a lecture for you. He's our substance guru. So he is a game guy, and he lives in substance all the time. So it's good. We just drag him out, throw some raw meat at him. Here, substance. So you have a choice. You're going to pick one of these 4 render cams for the daytime. Whatever one you want, doesn't matter. You're going to choose one nighttime version of the same scene. Lighting's going to be a little bit different. Lights are different in it. A couple of different camera angles. So that's 2 renders so far. And then you guys are going to go find, once you're done with those 2 renders, you're going to go find some reference, and you're going to try to recreate a camera composition that you find on the internet. Now, the stipulation is that you use one of our scenes, either daytime or nighttime, find reference. Your reference should be either daytime or nighttime also. And you're going to try to reconstruct and frame the scene similar to what you have in your reference.
Lighting wise.
No, this is not a lighting exercise. This is just composition and rendering. And by composition, I mean you're going to be doing basically a layout. A layout simply means you're going to get the basic look and feel of your reference without necessarily having all the geometry in there. Layout is simple, basic shapes that stand in for higher res images.
So just a cube.
So I'll come back to all this. So let me show you a couple examples of what other classes do. All right, so Different scene, but they found reference for a living room scene, and they framed the shot up based on our geometry, similar to what the reference is. So here's one. This camera lens is called a fisheye lens, so they went and they recreated basically a scene similar to the one that we have here. Not exact, but it kind of gets the look and feel of it. Here's another one. This one's a little bit closer. Again, some of the similar elements. This one is actually concept art. But notice they got the vanishing point, and that works. It's really just a stand-in. The whole idea is how creative can you be given limitations like this? Again, layout is all about getting the look and feel without having the geometry and all the resources to do it. Because a lot of times your boss is going to come up and go, listen, we need a quick layout of this. And that just means you may only have time to throw some cylinders and spheres and cubes in there and rectangles. And just position them to get stand-in position or to get stand-in geometry for what the final is going to look like. Once you get it approved, then the client goes, okay, I like the camera angle, I like where you're going with it. All right, go ahead. And then you start modeling the stuff and you start putting high-res stuff in there. This is designed to be quick, down and dirty, creative. All right, so here's another one. Again, just stand in. Stand in, got the vanishing point. You know, got bicycle, got barbells there, but that's all right. Kind of works. Yeah, kind of. Ish. So you can have fun with it. You get the idea? And then, that's always a fun one. Now, you can move geometry around, you can scale it, you can duplicate it, you just can't make any on your own. It's not modeling class, it's not a lighting class. You are stuck with the lighting that we give you. Okay. So if it's daytime, pick the daytime scene. If it's nighttime, pick the nighttime one. Again, look and feel. Rearrange the stuff, do what you need to do. You can have fun with it if you want. You can take it as serious or as fun as you want. But it does need to match, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking, yeah, that kind of gets the look and feel of it. They kind of got the whole idea that the alien is peeking through doors. All right, there's my alien, he's backlit, there's lighting behind there. All that stuff you want to take into account. So you're going to find your own reference. Now, these are the templates you guys are going to be doing for us. You're going to be dropping your stuff in there. So,
What format is the picture?
what format is what picture?
These pictures, like the turn-ins. The runners.
The turn-ins are all going to be targas.
All being what?
Targa files.
Okay.
TGA format. Out of Photoshop. In fact, this is a good chance for me to show you the templates, since you're asking about them. Now, when you download your little mini packet, when all your download stuff is here at the bottom, there's your rendering and denoise workflow PDF, which is basically a PDF version of what I just went over on using denoise. And then here's your Project 1. When you download Project 1 SAL-CRM, that gives you a folder that opens up with 3 subfolders. There's your Maya project folder, contains all the different folders you need. There's a scenes file in there, daytime, nighttime scene. Source images, anything that we use as far as imagery goes, and we are using basically what's called an HDR image outside the window, and it also functions a little bit like a light in there. You guys don't have to worry about that till we get into environment lighting. But that's in there already. And this project folder contains everything you need to render out your scene. templates. Here is the PSD daytime template. Pretty much, I think you guys all have the same version of Creative Cloud I have. You should. So the way our templates are set up, they're set up in layers. Your reference is going to be at the top. And you say, but wait, suppose I don't choose that image as my reference. So what you can do is go down to the reference images group here, expand it, and you can turn off and on the reference that you chose to do for the daytime. Whatever one works. And then you bring your image into the bottom. You drop it in. Change your watermark here. It's going to be your last name, your first name, and your month code. And to change that, that's under the watermarks group. Right here, just click on it. Get the text tool. Highlight it. Can't even spell my own name. Make sure you spell your name right. No, underscore. There we go. Now, you can make it bigger, you can make it smaller if you want, but it's got to be in there. Then you're going to go down at the bottom here. And this should be under the template section. So you're basically going to be changing the max samples. Oh, it's under render. Okay. So you're basically going to be changing what max samples did you use? Did you change the number of light samples, BXDF, indirect samples, and then how long did your render take in the end? Now, you guys will be batch rendering, so your batch renderer will have the final time at the end when it's done rendering. That'll be what you use. Now, to bring your images in here, all you have to do is go File, Open, find your render. Oh, you got to be out of the text tool for that. All right, so let me see. Let me bring in one of my renders. Alright, so there's my EXR. I'm going to click that open. When you open an EXR in Photoshop, it's automatically going to ask you, do you want the alpha channel data to be transparency or alpha channel? Just say transparency is the default. You don't even have to worry about it. Just click OK. It will open your render up. Now, what you can do to get this into the template is select all, which is, what's your shortcut key for that? Control A. Yep. And I want to copy. Well, actually on a Mac it's Command, but yeah. If you're on a PC it's Control, on a Mac it's Command. Copy. You can close it, go down to your render down here, and if you click on the reference folder and hit paste, it will drop it in as the top layer. Take the move tool, drop it in down here. Snap to guides should be turned on. And you can always zoom in just to make sure it snaps up right to the top there. There we go. You want to make sure there's no like dark lines, light lines, the image isn't half hanging off. And then when you're done, you can save your PSD. That way if you ever have to go back in and change something, you'll be able to edit it. But when you turn it into us, you're going to go File, Save As, and you're going to change the format from Photoshop to Targa. You're going to give it the right naming format, which we have listed in FSO. Hit Save, and it's going to ask you Targa options. Do you want the resolution to be 16, 24, 32? Leave it on 24. If you go to 16, it will cause banding. If you go to 32, nothing bad will happen, but it will create an extra channel and make a file size bigger for no reason. We're not using alpha channels till we get into texturing. Then you just hit OK. Make sense? So it's pretty simple to use. It should be pretty intuitive. So we have a separate template for the nighttime because you can just choose your reference based on what you want. Now, for your image that you're going to work on and render, your composition that you're going to make, choose one of the templates that works. And all you have to do is just drop your reference into the top here. Your reference, if you get it and it does not fit the aspect ratio or the entire frame, don't stretch it or distort it. Keep it undistorted. Put it in. Don't increase the size if it's not big enough. Obviously, if it's too big, scale it down, but don't stretch it. Keep it proportionate. That make sense? I don't care if there's lines on either side. In fact, you know, if you want to get rid of that, all you have to do is just turn off the reference. Your image will come in here, and if there's a gray bar on the side, that's fine. I don't care about that. Because I know not all reference off the internet is going to be HD format. One thing I do care about, though, is your render should look nice and look like it's snapped into the template. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Questions about that part?
So I got a question about this. We're getting a picture off from the internet,
Yes.
and then we're gonna render the room without moving the lights, or do we get?
You can't move the lights.
No.
Nope. The only thing you move is you're going to make your own camera. You're going to frame up the shot. You're going to use our geometry, but you can rearrange it. This is not a lighting exercise. Just remember that. So, if your light is coming in from the right side, just make sure your camera has, if you're doing a daytime scene, just make sure your camera is positioned so that the light is on your right. And if you have to, move the geometry around to accommodate for that. That's a good question, though. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay.
Any way you would recommend us to for a picture, or just like any picture that you can grab?
Well, you want to get something that all the shapes that are in that room that are available to you, you can get the look and feel of what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do a mountain, like, you know, a cliff on the edge of a mountain, say there's a house up there, we don't have anything that remotely looks like that. So it's probably, you're going to look for the interior of a room. And most of the most successful things that we've had, people have found bedroom pictures, either from a horror film or like a interior design magazine. If you want to get creative and do like sci-fi or something like that, those shapes will work. If you want to make the inside of a spaceship and try and get perspective and stuff, you can just rearrange the geometry, just like
The guy with the aliens.
yeah, the guy with the aliens picture, or where is it at?
The one with the buildings?
Yeah, like this one.
I have a question.
That one would be a good one. I mean, you kind of got it to look like a city. Yes, question.
Our render, like, are we saving it through Maya, or are we taking a screenshot? How is it gonna work?
Your render?
Yeah, like.
You're
when we-
doing it in Render Man, and you're rendering, you're batch rendering.
Okay, so when,
It automatically saves the size, the image format, and the naming based on what you set up in the render settings.
Okay.
So I'm going to show you actually how that works right now. So what I'm going to do is set my project to the Project 1 folder. All right, so here is my Maya project folder. I'm going to go inside of it but not select any subfolders because I want Maya to use this as my top folder. I'm going to hit set. Now, Maya knows that that is my project folder. If I go File Open, it should take me into the Scenes folder because I set the project. So what I need to do is go File, Set Project, find my project folder, hit set, I'm in there. Now when I go File Open, it's going into the Scenes folder automatically and I can choose daytime or nighttime. I'll choose day. All right, student version, yeah, I know, blah, blah, blah. If you get this error message, mental ray nodes, mental ray's evil. We stopped using mental ray a couple of months ago, but it's evil. So just click OK, and don't worry about that. Click OK. It's embedded into the scene file, and I can't get rid of it. So here's your render cam. You can always change cameras by going to Panels, Perspective. Oh, look, different perspective cameras. Whee! But the render cam is the one that you are going to use. Now, I'm in the render cam, but suppose I don't want to do that scene. Go under View to Bookmarks, and I've got 4 bookmarks there that you can change. So, bookmarks, the shot number 1, 16 millimeter, that's this. You go to shot 2, 35 millimeter, that's a different scene. Shot 3 is a 24 millimeter overhead on the computer, and then here's a kind of a wide shot. It's a long lens, 70 millimeter. So you're going to choose one of those to do. Make sense? So you've got that chosen, and you're getting ready to figure out what you need to do to render. So first off, open up your render settings. Make sure RenderMan is set as your renderer. You don't have to worry about common yet until you go to batch render. Because right now, everything we're going to render is going to be temporary. So I'm going to go under sampling. I'm going to look, okay, 128, that's the default. IPR 64. I like 32 because, like I said, I want quick feedback. So now, what do? How do I start this process? First thing you can do is, this little eyeball right here will open the image tool for you. So click on that. Takes a second to load up. There you go. It will say empty. By default, you should get the render area here in the middle, catalog on the left, inspector on the right. Now, I want to get a render, or I want to render in here. First thing you want to do is right-click on IPR and choose the camera you want to render from. So I want to render from the render cam. Now, it's going to use 32 max samples to render. It's going to take a little while for it to kick in. The first time you render, it's got to build all the files, especially the image outside the window. So it may seem like it's taking forever. You may think, oh, I got the pinwheel of death. Just hang in there. It takes a good 30 seconds to build that file. It's converting a high dynamic range file into a Pixar file. So it's a good chance to sit back.
I got a question because I already started, and the colors are different from the reference images of what's in here. Is that meant to be, or am I doing something wrong?
There should be no color.
Because the reference image looks gray, this one looks kind of brown.
Then you're probably doing the nighttime scene.
No, it's daytime.
All right, so there we go. My render kicked off. Now, a lot of times it will not be, the image tool will not be framed to the size of your image. So what you can do in the image tool is go up to View, Resize Window to Image. And that way it will go into the HD 540. And as it renders, every time it renders another pass, it gets a little better. All right, now, what I'm going to do is hit cancel or escape. So this is the cancel button here. If anybody wants to cancel it, or escape, that stops the render. So now, most of the time, I do not even let it finish doing its 32 passes. Because I can see right now where I'm going to have noise. Notice that the areas where you get direct light, there's very little noise in them. Those are the areas that clean up faster. Remember I said direct light is the shortest cleanup time, the shortest render time, because it's a direct path to the camera. The camera sees that more than it sees all the other indirect stuff. You asked me about re-randomizing something. So, yeah, Russian roulette. So now here, we've got samples that are put in randomly. However, even though they're random, you can still see there's areas that are clumped. Right? You can see little clumps all over the place. Right here, even down here where it looks pretty simple. Right? All those areas. Theoretically, when you re-randomize something, it's going to come in and redistribute the pixels again. Or redistribute, the samples again. To try and get it a little bit more random. The trouble with doing that is the denoise filter works with the default setting. So it's expecting to get rid of noise based on its original setting. If you re-randomize it, you can actually increase your render time and not get any better results. At least in this version of the render manager. Like I said, they're looking to make this a lot simpler, so I doubt that's even going to be there in the future. They may just have a re-random button or something that will do everything for you. But basically, it's just trying to redistribute everything. But this is the way we overcome that. So in here, I'm going to say areas that are in direct light and in shadow. Right here, that looks like it's going to be pretty noisy. Any area that's got indirect light, like in here, where the radiator, where it's relying on nothing but bounce light, in here, these are going to be the areas that are going to be noisiest. So what I'm going to do is, that's about the extent of IPR. Now I'm going to go in and do what's called a crop. I'm just going to take a tool, marquee an area, and have it just render that area so I can see what production quality settings look like in a small area rather than rendering the entire scene. Does that make sense? So, what happens is you take small areas, test out some production settings. If you can get them to look good on all the different areas, then it probably is going to look good for the entire render. Then you can try doing a batch render, see what it looks like for a final version. All right, so how long should this take? The final version is probably going to be somewhere between, depending on your computer, what you got going on, anywhere from 15 minutes to a half hour. For this.
For what?
For one. Yes, somebody had a question. Yes.
I don't have the catalog section.
So you can either go up to view under, I think it's under window, or you can hit C for catalog.
Did it pop in?
Yes.
Yep. So C or I will turn catalog and inspector off and on. Now, on the right side, notice that it gives me a lot of information. It told me I'm doing 0 max samples, 32 min. That's my pixel variance setting, path tracer, direct light, indirect light, BXDF, and my render time. So I get a lot of information from that. Now, here's how you use the crop area. This little area right here that looks like a cropper, Crapper? Yeah, clapper. I put the L and the R in the wrong place. All right, so it looks like a clapper. You click on that button, and it will allow you to left click and drag and marquee a section. Now, if I want to render just that section, I can hit the R key. R as in Romeo. And what it will do is render just that section, but notice the rest of it disappears. And it will use the production settings that are at the top, which is 0 min samples, 128 max samples. Now, the nice thing is, a smaller area, it's going to render a lot quicker because it doesn't have a huge area to render from. So every single pass that it does, every iteration, it gets better and better. Now, as this is going on, I can always go back and look at my original area. And it finished. Now, if I want to keep that first image as my background, there is a background button right here you can click that will keep it. That way when I switch images, it will just show me the cropped area. Now, 128 samples, is that enough for a final render? No, definitely not. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to start to work on my settings. Right, so max samples, what's my next bump up in the power of 2? 256. Right, 256. Now, down here under integrator, usually what I like to do is I'll probably bump up the indirect samples. I'll go to 2. Now, I've doubled the samples. I've bumped up the indirect a little bit. I'm going to hit the R key again to render just that small section. Now, when I'm using the R key, that is not IPR. It's not interactive. It is committed to rendering full-blown production quality of that small section. Once I find I can get this clean and it looks pretty good, I'll try another section. If I'm happy with that, then I might try a full-blown batch render. Now, at any time this is rendering, I can go back and forth between my previous little cropped render, like right here, and compare. Now, down here at the bottom, I'm only 33%. So, yeah, I'm getting up on that quality, but I still got a ways to go. So you can see why batch rendering would be a lot quicker because it doesn't have an interface it has to display. So this utilizes resources. In fact, they told us at Pixar that they had to slow down the image tool display because the renderer would actually render faster than it could keep up with refreshing the screen. And that's why batch renderer runs a little faster. All right, so it's still going, still going, still going. All right, so here is 128 and 256. An improvement, but probably not enough. Now, if I want to change position, say I want to look at another area, just to see what that looks like, I can move my crop simply by selecting it, and I can drag it over here, or I can delete it, clicking the little X in the upper corner and just redrawing it. So if I hit R down here, it's going to render just that area. And I can see what it looks like with those settings in another section. If I come up with the same amount of noise, then I'm probably going to have to bump it up to another level. Probably 512. But as you see here, this direct area cleans up almost immediately. It's the little shadowy indirect areas that are a lot noisier.
Question.
Yes.
So whenever I crop and start the render, it always puts the area of crop into its own separate like tab, but it's just the object, like the scene is missing from it.
Yeah, that's because you have to turn the background on like I did. There is, what you do is you select where you first rendered the entire scene. If you click on that in the catalog, and it looks like a little landscape with a sun or a moon button. You click on that, that will keep that image as your background.
Okay.
And then you can switch over and it'll just keep it as your background.
All right.
Now, if I turn that off, I mean, I just like to have it so I can see what the rest of the scene looks like to compare. You really don't need it because you're just,
It looks like utter garbage
yeah.
here.
Right, so you can see this is with the simple IPR, and then
How would I go about removing crop, like the red stripe?
well, just like I just showed. You can select it, you can move it around like this, or delete it and redraw it.
Right.
You have to choose the crop tool here, and then left click and drag. When you hover above the buttons, they'll tell you what they are. So you click on crop, left click and drag. If you've already got a crop in there, you can click on that, you can delete it, redraw a new one, or you can move that one around. You have to hit the R key to re-render inside the crop. You're basically just rendering in that small area. All right, so I can pretty much say that 256 is not enough, at least for me. So I might go 512, re-render some small cropped areas. If I'm happy, I can commit to doing a batch render of this scene. Now to set up a batch render, I'm going to pretend that I'm all set to batch render. Now, when you go to close the image tool, it's going to say to you, hey, do you want to save anything? If you don't save anything, I'm going to throw everything away. Now, in the image tool, you can save your session if you want to. It'll basically save the image tool with all the little renders you did on the side, with all your information, if you need it for whatever reason. If you hit don't save, then you guys need help? In the front?
His catalog taskbar is missing.
Just hit C. It's also under View. Now, if you close the image tool, it will discard everything that's there. So be very sure that you want to do that. If you open it again, gone. All right, so let me set this up for you for batch rendering. Now, since I do not have OpenEXR in my render settings, I'm going to use RenderMan Advanced RenderMan Controls. So for name, I'm just going to call this Day Scene 1. Image format, OpenEXR. Frame, I want to have single frame, dot extension. Dot extension is very important. If you forget that, you're going to have a render with no extension. Photoshop's not going to know what it is. It's not going to know how to open it until you put an extension on there. All right, everybody got that? Name dot number. If you're not sure, go into the batch rendering guide, the PDF that I have. All right, choose your camera that you want to render from. Render cam is always going to be the selected render cam. The size, no problem. All right, here, probably going to choose 512 integrator. It's going to keep all your settings that you had if you changed anything in Maya's render settings. Features, I'm going to turn denoise to frame. Filter, the default is fine. Everything else is fine. You don't have to mess with anything else. I advise you at this point to save your scene. Actually, at any time, you should always do a save as. Do not work on the original files. Now, to start a batch render, you go to RenderMan, Batch Render, right here. Click on it. It's immediately going to ask you to save again because it's saving a temporary file. Give it a second, and it's going to open up the local queue. Now, if your local queue fails and it says error and turns red, that means you need to go into Windows, Settings and Preferences, Preferences, go down to RenderMan. In RenderMan, scroll down to Batch Queuing and scroll down to the Reset button for the environment key. Why? I have no idea. Other than occasionally you get an error batch rendering for the first time if you've never done it before, and it just for some reason can't figure out where you've got your RenderMan stuff. So click on Reset, it'll find it, and when you batch render it should work. Yes, you had a question?
I was going to ask if you could repeat the steps
For finding the preferences?
yes, if you get the red.
If you get the red, go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Preferences. Left side, go to RenderMan. On the right side, scroll down to Batch Queuing, Environment Key, Reset button. And then make sure you save after you hit the Reset button. And then try batch rendering again. All right, so there is, oh man, I got way too much run. I'm surprised Maya didn't blow up. All right, so this is a good reason why you don't have all this other stuff running. You quit out of Photoshop because Photoshop and Maya don't get along. I'm going to quit out of Acrobat and other stuff I can't quite quit out of. Now, where is your render going? Inside the RenderMan folder in your project folder. So, if I go here, my Maya project RenderMan, there we go, right here. And it will give you an encrypted name here. It's going to be whatever your file name is, and then it will be a timestamp, or actually a date, and then timestamp. So I started rendering at 1719. This, when it's done, is where it's going to dump my images. This is where you will retrieve them for Photoshop. Actually, look at them, make sure they're worthy of going into Photoshop. But if you've done your rendering in the image tool and denoised it as much as you can, your render should be final should be finished. Does that make sense? Questions? Now, if you need to stop your batch render or pause it, you can right-click on it. You can pause new tasks. You can stop the active and pause the job. Or you can do like what I'm going to do and delete. You will know your fan goes on quite a bit when you start rendering. In fact, you're probably going to think it's going to hover. It's going to go on. Your computer is definitely going to get hot, so do not restrict any airflow around your computer. Don't try to close the lid of your computer while you're rendering. It will go to sleep. It will not continue to render. Also, make sure you're plugged in to get the most efficient use out of your graphics card. Yeah. Well, screensavers aren't too bad. I find though, if you put your or the brightness on your screen down to like the bottom notch right before it goes off, that'll help keep your computer cool because it does the screen generates heat. That's not a bad. However, you will not have ice cubes. you will have liquid ice cubes. All right, one more thing I want to go over before I let you guys go for break, and that's just a quick tour of cameras, because you're going to be starting to figure out how lenses work, even if it's in the most basic form. So, camera lenses, and this information goes for real-world cameras and also CD cameras. So lenses can do two things. They can either focus light or they can disperse light. The focus light means you bring something sharp, image into focus where you can see detail. If you defocus it or disperse it, you are basically creating an impressionistic view of what's really there. You don't see much detail. Now, camera lenses are actual pieces of glass arranged so that they either magnify or shrink an image onto the camera's either sensor or, nobody uses film anymore, but film. Now, the way camera lenses are measured are from the back of the lens itself, the very last piece of glass, to the actual sensor that's in the camera that picks up the information. Now, based on the distance and the shape of the lens will determine what kind of lens it's categorized under. So, lenses for this first category called fisheye all have a curved top on them. They are very similar to looking out the peephole of a door. You look out the peephole of a door, it's designed to give you almost a 180 view of what's outside. That's exactly what fisheye lenses do. That curved top on it allows the light to be, basically bent into the frame as much as possible. Also, it's a very short distance between the back of the lens to the sensor. It creates, based on the shape of the lens, this kind of what we call barrel distortion. Things tend to get exaggerated the closer they are to the camera. Now, the next lens group, and this can go anywhere from 2.5 to 15, but generally, it's going to be under 15 millimeters for a fisheye lens. A wide-angle lens, the top of the lens is curved slightly, but not as bubbly as the fisheye. The distance between the back of the lens and the camera sensor is a little bit greater. It still shrinks the image onto the sensor, but not as much. We don't get as an exaggerated look as we did with the fisheye. Now, wide-angle lenses are frequently used in real estate
saw your apartment online before you moved. Look big, right?
Yeah.
You said, wow, look at this. You get in there and, oh, okay, here's the living room, here's the bathroom, there's the the kitchen's there too. Oops, I stepped on it. I mean, it just makes things look expansive. They do that for backyards, front yards, porches, you know, landscape. Makes things look kind of spread out and open without feeling too distorted like a fisheye, where it kind of makes you feel a little uneasy. However, you know, depending on the range that you're using, the lower the focal length or the smaller the number, you're going to get more distortion closer to the camera than you would if you were here. So I had a friend of mine shoot this for me. This is a 16 millimeter, and this is a 24 millimeter. Now, to be honest, most realtors use either 24 millimeter lens or 35 millimeter. 35 millimeter is the default lens in Maya. It's a wide angle lens. If you're a modeler, you need to know that, because you need to know what kind of lens was my reference image shot with. Was it shot with a wide angle lens? If it's shot with a wide angle lens, I need to make my camera, when I model, wide angle so I don't model distortion in it. Or, in the case of the next one, if you're a modeler, you want what's called a normal lens, because that gives you the least amount of distortion. We also call this a portrait lens. Portrait lenses are usually 50 millimeter. 50 millimeter means that you are going to minimize any distortion at all. It doesn't shrink the image, and it does not magnify the image to distort features. The reason it's called portrait lenses, you don't want to elongate somebody's nose or make the sides of their ears look tiny. You know, you want it to be proportionate in display. So, if you're a modeler and you want reference that's non-distorted, ask for a normal lens, 50 millimeter lens. Now, if you have to shoot something a great distance away, you can't get to it practically, you need to use what's called a telephoto lens. That means you can take the image and magnify something really far away onto the camera sensor. Now, the problem with that is, it's a great idea, but the problem with that is you get what's called lens compression. We're all taught that we've got a foreground, a midground, and a background, right? What happens if you take something a far distance away that has a foreground, midground, background, you bring that forward, what happens to all the planes? They flatten.
You lose depth.
You lose depth. So here's an example here. These buildings, are they alongside each other?
Yeah.
Is there an alleyway? Is there a street between them? You can't tell because of the lens compression. Same thing here. Sports. They use long lenses all the time in sports because you can't practically get onto the field and shoot a picture without getting killed. So, you take a big giant, looks like the barrel of a cannon, and you stick it on a stand and you shoot a picture. Great. Looks great, great detail, but lens compression. How far away is player one in the foreground from the player behind him? Could be a couple inches, could be a couple feet, could be a couple yards. So, notice scale doesn't really help either because they're all flattened together. So one thing that photographers will do, with intentionally or unintentionally, is blur the background. So at least you have something to focus on. And when you're using a long lens, you usually set how far away you want the image to be focused. So, you know, I'm guessing he probably shot that, you know, probably 50, 60 feet away, at least, maybe more. So probably going to zoom in on the players, focus them, and don't care about anything else. But, again, magnifying the image, you get lens compression. Now, in lighting, if you get something with a lens compression problem like this, and it's an environment, we have to bring depth back into the scene with light. We have to be able to separate the planes to get back depth. We'll get into that when we get into lighting. But the reason I mentioned these 4 lens types is because when you look at reference, one of your reference images is going to fall into this category. If it's distorted, it looks like you're looking through the peephole of a door, it's probably what? Fisheye. Range for a fisheye, somewhere between 2.5 and 14 millimeter. I think we had 15 up there. If it looks a little distorted, but it just looks expansive, like a realtor photo, think wide angle. Probably somewhere, if it was shot with a real camera, it's probably somewhere between 24 and 35 millimeters. Anybody know what are most of your phones? They are really tiny focal lengths because they're, little tiny little lens designed to take in a lot of information.
Yeah.
Most of them are wide angle.
Yeah.
Some of them almost verge on fisheye. Doesn't make them bad, it just, that's the limitation. You can still get really good pictures if you know how to work around.
Really good.
Really, yes. Especially now with pixel depth and the retina displays and megapixel cameras. We're going to get into gigapixels soon. Yeah, it's going to make a world of difference. All right. If you don't see any distortion at all, you might see people in it. Portrait camera, portrait lens, normal lens. If it looks like it's magnified or shot from a long distance away, it's probably going to be some kind of telephoto. If it looks like you have some compression from your planes in there, that'll at least get you into the right type of setting. Now, in addition to that, when you go to create a camera, you guys know how to create stuff in Maya, right? Create a camera, it's going to drop it where? Center of the world, right? 0, 0, ground plane. So, in order to look through that lens, here's what you're going to want to do. Normally I would do this with slides, but forget it. I'll just do this. Let's go back into perspective here. So let's say I want to create my own composition. Say I've got composition of a computer desk. Now, you can see I've got some limitations here because I've got a 35 millimeter lens from perspective. First thing you're going to do is create a camera. Right? Create cameras, the very first one at the top. Now, camera is going to drop in at the center of the world. So I'm going to go wireframe and zoom out. And there's my teeny tiny cute little camera down here. Now, in order for me to be able to use this, I need to be able to look through it. Now, to look through it, you can just go into viewport, go to panels, perspective. There's your new camera. Now, when I look through it, I'm going to be like basically in the floor of my scene. Also, take a look here in the camera attributes. The focal length by default for anything in Maya, perspective camera, top view, front view, side view, any view is going to be 35 millimeters. So you have to decide, what does my reference look like? This is where you guess. So if you think, oh, mine looks distorted, it looks like I'm looking through a fisheye. There's your fisheye lens. So let's go down to something really extreme like 2.5. And you can see that it looks like you're in light speed. Whoa. All right, so wide angle, 24 millimeter.
Wow, that's a huge difference. 35 millimeter, 50, portrait lens style. 70, that starts roughly telephoto. Starting to compress, I'm starting to lose depth between the foreground here, the midground, the background. The next one up is probably 100. I mean, these are common lenses I'm giving you guys. That real world lenses, you know, that's what Maya's trying to mimic. So again, we're magnifying. So you figure out which lens it's going to be. Now, in order to frame your shot up even better, you need to be able to establish where is my camera going to render from. And you need to turn on the resolution gate, which is this little white box with a cyan circle in the center. Click on that. That will give you an area that is designated by, if you've got it selected, it'll be a white box. If you deselect it, it'll be kind of greenish. It's hard to tell. I'm going to select the camera again. And it will create a little bit of a mask around the outside. Basically, only allow like 25-50% to show through. Anything inside this frame will be your render. And it's going to grab the settings from your render settings for the size. So you set your composition up, use the rule of thirds, do whatever you want to do. Realize you've got some limitations, because if you zoom out too far, you're going to be outside the room. Whoa. There you go. Make sense? This will help you when you go to frame your own shot. It's always a good idea also name your camera. You can rename it, go under Windows, Outliner. It's going to call that my render cam. Maya hates spaces, so either put an underscore or run your words together. Questions? Wear earplugs so it doesn't leak out. All the information. All right, one last thing. If you look inside the activity, down at the bottom under deliverables, you're going to be turning in 3 Maya scene files. You're going to save your scene when you're done rendering with the render settings. For the day scene, you've got a separate Maya file. Save it for the night scene, separate Maya file. Then for your composition, after you've framed it, put your camera in, got the render settings, save that version. Those are your 3 Maya scene files. Then you're going to also upload a template for each one. Composition 1 is going to be your daytime. Composition 2 is going to be your nighttime. Composition 3 is going to be your comp. Here's your file naming right here.
So we get our picture, we set up our scene, we take our render, and then we give you a file of the render we just took, right? Like we give you the Maya files of the render that we just took.
Yep. With your final version of your render settings. So if I'm looking at your scene and I go, what did he use for render settings? I can open your scene up and see exactly what you did.
Is it just the Maya file, or do we have to bundle everything like the Word?
What does it say here?
Just Maya files?
Nope.
It's a folder.
A folder with 3 Maya scene files and 3 templates. So make sure that you get, if you have any questions, ask. Definitely. About that. But always check the project here for the deliverables that you need. Your reference, that's going to be in your template, so I don't need a separate file for that. Right. Any other questions?